So thank you so much for taking the time. We have Heidi Tinsman with us, professor in the history department here at the University of California, Irvine, and also affiliated faculty with the Center of Latin American and Caribbean Studies. And so would love to sort of take the advantage today to look at your career and how it's kind of like how it started, how it's progressed, and also to where it is today. Talking maybe in the sort of the first place about your first book, I think that's a great jumping off point for us to take a look at what was important for how you found sort of your niche in the field and the discipline, and then kind of later looking at where it's developed into what your research is about today. So Partners in Conflict, Politics of Sexuality, Gender, and Labor in the Chilean Agrarian Reform from 1950 to 1973. This came out in 2002. And you start with a fascinating anecdote about your time working in rural Chile with, I believe it was the first union of temporary fruit workers. And this experience was super important for your formation and professionalization as an academic. But I would love to hear a little bit about what led you to be in Chile in 1991, just after the Pinochet dictatorship ended, and what led you to studying the agrarian reform?
Great. Well, thank you. It's nice to be here. I was in Chile in 1991 because I was contemplating dropping out of graduate school. I was in I was studying history at Yale, and I had come originally to work on Mexican women's history. Then I was working on Brazilian women's history, and I thought I wanted to become a labor lawyer instead. And I got an internship working in Chile for a labor union, this first union of temporary fruit workers. And so I was in Chile basically preparing my application to law school. And when I was in Chile working with the union, it was thrilling. I mean, this was a union that was half women. They were very much in the leadership roles. They were talking about what democracy should look like now that Pinochet had stepped down. And I realized, I still had my historian's head on my shoulders, and I realized that they were talking about social justice and citizenship in ways that harkened back to the time of Salvador Allende and Eduardo Frei in the 1960s and the early 70s, the time of Chile's agrarian reform, when the Chilean state expropriated half of Chile's farmland and redistributed it to peasants, and men and women were incorporated into the labor movement. And long story short, I mean, I decided to stay in history. I decided to stay in Chile. And I decided that if I really wanted to understand, the women workers of the 1990s and the labor union they were building and their pleas and petitions for social justice and the way they were combining it with feminism, I needed to actually look at the social justice movements of the peasant movements during the agrarian reform years of Chile's radical democracy. So, it was a very important moment. It affected my entire career because I decided to stay, decided to continue to do my PhD in history, and I've been working on Chile ever since.
Absolutely, and it was really fascinating to read that anecdote in your book and also to hear you talk about it now, because I think it gets at some of your core beliefs as a scholar and an academic, because you've continued to work with maybe not exactly the same context, but a focus on peasants and a focus on the relationship with the land, and that's kind of carried you through. And it is really fascinating to hear you talk about that. Another thing that I think comes out of the book is a little bit your methodological approach too, in looking at how colonialism can often lead into other methods of subordination in modern day systems. And in this book, a little bit what you're trying to do is challenge that easy one-to-one relationship that it's not going to be so easily
Oh,
explained
absolutely.
or that simple.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit maybe about that.
Well, the through line in my research is a focus on gender and labor in agrarian communities. So that I'm still working on gender and labor in agrarian communities, peasant communities, really in different contexts. And as a historian of gender and labor and capitalism, in some ways I'm approaching that not as colonialism. I am approaching that as a very modern formation. And so I'm interested in the way that as different kinds of states, be they socialist states or, military dictatorships or Popular Front, developmentalist states, are interested in creating different projects around labor and land and productivity that have different impacts for men and women and incorporate men and women into, national projects in different ways. So in the in the Partners in Conflict book, I was really interested in how both the Christian Democrats, who were a project that were interested in reforming capitalism, making it more democratic and participatory, shared a lot with Salvador Allende's socialist project when it came to uplifting peasant populations through a model of male-headed family in which men, were being empowered to be, the producer citizens of the nation, and women were being encouraged to be modern housewives, educated, civically minded, fully active in, organizations of the community, but in ways that were secondary to men's primary positions as producers for the nation. So and then I look in some ways at the way that male-headed family gets built and then challenged in serious ways during the Pinochet dictatorship. It's not so much colonialism that motivates my interests, but the way in which capitalist modernity is built, by Latin Americans and by very different kinds of projects. Agrarian reform is not thrust upon Chile by the outside. It's a project that the Chilean left, that Chilean Catholics, and a wide variety of people had been building a consensus around for some time. And it takes a different shape under, Christian democracy than it does under socialism. And even when the military comes to power, they don't so much dismantle the agrarian reform as they take it in a different neoliberal direction. And I'm very interested in seeing, Chileans, both peasants and at all level of government, military, socialist, democratic, not democratic, the ways in which they're undertaking and helming these projects, and the way that men and women get incorporated to them in different ways. In Partners in Conflict, I was also writing against a kind of body of literature that existed at the time, feminist scholarship, really important feminist scholarship that had said, women were excluded from agrarian reforms in Cuba, in Nicaragua, in Chile, in Mexico, because all of those states, very different kinds of states, promoted men as the producers and women as housewives. And men are the ones who are in the unions, men are the ones who are getting titles to the land, etc. Women are excluded. And my project was wanting to think about that in a different way and think about how women benefited hugely from the agrarian reform. They were big supporters of it, and they were incorporated differently and unequally than men, but they were nonetheless incorporated and benefited. But the way they were incorporated differently and unequally also put them in positions that made it more difficult for women to navigate the political turmoil of the class conflict and political crisis that came to a head in 1973 on the eve of the military coup against Allende.
Absolutely, and I think it's you talk a little bit about the utopic vision and sort of this idea of utopia that in some ways is sort of the inheritance from the Allende years, right? And, you're now in 1991, you're looking at unionization efforts of these temporary fruit workers, and you're seeing almost the way that like these political projects and fights for economic rights are rhyming or forming parallels. And I think that your methodological approach really allows you to kind of hone in on these sites of negotiations and these fields in which nothing's a given. You have a lot of cultural references that are at play at one time. It's never as simple as colonialism or post-colonialism, that there are a lot of different references that individual communities are working with and drawing from and leveraging and re-articulating. And you also have so many different agents. And I think that that's something that's really interesting about that book, is looking at women as agents and active political participants.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, women, in the 60s and the 70s, during the agrarian reform of the Christian Democrats, and then later under Allende, they were in many ways excited about this project of empowering campesino peasant households through male-headed families in which men would not only earn good wages, they would be owners of the land, and women would, under this model, presumably benefit because men would hand over those wages, women would have education, women would be empowered to run small businesses out of their family, women would have access to, family planning, birth control. There is a way in which women latch on to the promises of modern domesticity in ways that challenge men's assumptions about the kinds of authority they can have over women in the home. And there's quite a bit of conflict between men and women during the agrarian reform, because women are actually holding men accountable to what they see as men's obligations to them as breadwinners, as people who should be accountable to them, telling them what's going on politically, why were you away from home for 2 weeks, et cetera. You got to tell me what's going on. It's my job to, take care, to basically my job to be in charge of the home while you're gone, et cetera. And that friction with men saw themselves as empowered to be their own bosses and more their own bosses in their own families. So there's a negotiation, a conflict between men and women about their rights and obligations within this ideal of, modern peasant family that agrarian reform is producing. And then under dictatorship, and this takes us to the second book, right, which is more about the Pinochet years, that model of family is thrown into crisis by the way that neoliberalism, shatters the ability of, campesino families to continue to realize that dream.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you brought up the second book project, because I see kind of the same connection there, and just in terms of the focus on gender and where that kind of leads you to is if you're looking at sort of the home, the household, if you're looking at these gendered domestic sites of negotiation as the locus for Chile's incorporation into neoliberalism and global capitalism. So Buying Into the Regime is the second book, comes out in 2014. Grapes and consumption in Cold War Chile and the United States. And so you're talking about the 70s and 80s, you're talking about sort of during the Pinochet regime, and you're focusing more a little bit on a transnational context here. You're looking
very much so. It's U.S. and the United States. Mm-hmm.
Exactly, that kind of like mirrored relationship, and you carry that dual focus throughout the book, looking at this reflective, the way that Chilean businesses are impacting culture in the U.S., also focusing on gender in that case too, at these notions of freshness and how those can even be shown to be gendered. And how would you say that these national contexts are informing and shaping each other mutually in sort of how you do this analysis in this second book?
Well, the second book, which in some ways is the topic that I arrived in Chile to embed myself in, women who became proletarianized by the grape export industry that emerges with force in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship. Women become wage workers in the processing of table grapes that get exported to the US, they get exported to Europe, they get exported to Asia, all over the world. And peasant communities in general get proletarianized. Men are working in the orchards for wages. They lose access to their land, all of that stuff, right? When I first went to Chile in 1991, I thought I wanted to tell the story of, women, building this union, in the last years of Pinochet as the new proletarianized workforce in the fruit export industry. Very much was going to be a story about Chile and these workers in these fruit packing plants. By the time I actually write Buying into the Regime, my ideas have changed a lot. And I wanted to think about the transnational dynamics of the fruit export industry, and I wanted to think about consumption as something that is happening and changing lives amongst, poor working class people in rural Chile, not just in the United States. So in Buying into the Regime, the consumption I'm most interested in is the consumption that fruit workers are doing, not eating grapes, but they are buying things with their wages that they didn't have access to before because they're circulating in new and cheaper ways in rural Chile. So, I'm looking at women grape workers buying used washing machines, used televisions, used radio cassette players, and feeling very proud of their ability to outfit their homes. In some cases, women are actually buying all of the materials to build the shanties that are the very insecure housing that people are living in. And women's ability to buy things for their homes and very much be co-breadwinners with men, or sometimes the only breadwinners. Men are often not there. There's a huge rise in single-family homes headed by women during the dictatorship. It puts women in a very different negotiating position vis-a-vis men and their families. I don't argue that dictatorship and exploitative wages under authoritarian neoliberalism were liberating for women. They were not liberating for women, but they transformed women and men's relationship to wage work in ways that made women's cash earning power just as important as men. And in some instances, women are earning more than men as well because of the piece rate work they do in the packing plants. And women's decisions over consumption, they are opting often to invest in used appliances that they buy in flea markets secondhand, or in some ways, sometimes they're just assembled by innovative, entrepreneurial poor communities. They not only take pride in those, but they operate as a kind of savings system for poor communities. During the winter months when there's no work, women will then pawn those objects. So women become really central to the kind of economic survival of their families, and they fight with men to have more control and say over, who's going to run things inside the house. Women very much lay claim to the principle that, I should be entitled to the fruits of my labor. And that pun is intended. I should be entitled, I earn the cash, and I will also decide how it is spent and how it is consumed. So there's a renegotiation of patriarchal power in and around the proletarianization of women and through decisions over consumption. In that argument about consumption, I'm kind of pushing back against the tendency to see, consumption in late capitalism as solely this, destructive, politically atomizing force in, say, in Latin America. And I'm seeing it as a place where politics happens in the family and where, women are exerting new forms of political control they didn't have. In the U.S. part of things, I'm looking at the impact of Chilean fruit exporters. These are Chilean businesses operating inside the United States who are very active in selling the idea of grapes as fresh and healthy eating for American women in particular. I mean, Chilean businesses are entrepreneurs who do the fresh sale. They sell the idea of fresh. Americans don't eat more grapes just because they're there. They do it because they are sold an idea that grapes are good for you, that, they're sexy, that they're perfect for the woman who's going back to work and is busy. She needs a quick snack for her kids' lunches. She's busy doing her own thing. They even have these proto-feminist messages. In my history of neoliberal, grape exports in Chile, I don't see neoliberalism as thrust on Chile by the United States or by Chicago. Chilean agribusiness are diehard neoliberals. They were diehard neoliberals, before Pinochet comes to power, and they take his reign as an opportunity to just run with it. And they are big players in kind of the political culture of marketing fresh produce in the United States. And they have deep ties with California ag that go back to the 1920s. So I also point out in this book that, grape exports do not start under Pinochet. They actually start in the 20s. And every single government of Chile, including Allende, socialist government, is interested in selling and exporting grapes to the United States. So that's kind of rethinking the trajectory and the historical development of export capitalism is also an important part of this book.
Yeah, truly a fascinating project to come out of the second book, both in terms of what you discovered about it and the way that you approached looking into it. It's fascinating to be, when you're thinking about the 70s and 80s in Chile, if you're thinking about what life is like for women, that it is to some degrees a conversation that you have to have looking at what's happening in the export markets that it's looking to sell its fruit to in the United States, and a little bit what's happening with women in the 70s and 80s in the United States, of how grapes are being marketed in a way that's very closely tied to ideas about gender. And the role of the woman in the household.
Today we expect, fresh fruit to be available all year round, whether it's, strawberries or raspberries or blueberries, you name it, right? The first fresh fruit that was marketed, globally, and that we expected to be available to us all year round, after the banana, is grapes. And that really starts because of Chile. California does not produce grapes all year, only half the year. The rest of them come from Chile. So Chile really creates the template for that year-round demand for fresh produce. And Chilean agribusiness is they are big players in spinning their fruit as not only healthy, but less third world, less Latin American, less tropical, less problematic than fruits that might come from Brazil. They very much play into, or they create a trope of whiteness around Chilean fruit that they then, peddle they peddle Chilean wares in the United States through these kinds of stories.
Absolutely. And I think it's also, when you're thinking about Chile, you're thinking about 70s and 80s and neoliberalism, how you take it as sort of the first example that then led to further and further incorporation of other countries in Latin America to similar models. And you do a great job of just showing that when you're talking about how that happened, it's not enough to talk about the Chicago boys. It's not enough to talk about these big
the Chicago
leaders.
boys in Chile were Chilean.
Yeah.
Often when people use the phrase Chicago boys, they think of it as a bunch of U.S. bureaucrats or economists who come. The Chicago boys are Chileans who study at the University of Chicago. But the people who were important to developing Chile's ag model, it develops before Pinochet, but the takeoff, the fruit export boom, those were Chileans who studied at the University of California. They were California boys. They went to UC Davis in the 60s and the 70s, and they, first developed grape exports with the full support of the state, because that's the model, right? Capitalism, that's going to get nice support from the state. When Pinochet's in power, these California Chile boys, are selling their wares through the same contacts that they made via California. So the trope of the Chicago boy has been insufficiently unpacked and, overused. And here I'm not just being picky about like, they actually went to the University of California, but the role of U.S. universities in Latin American education is a century-long thing, and I really think it's important to talk about the agency of different Latin American actors in building what became Chile's fruit export sensation. And it starts way before Pinochet. Another key argument I make in that book is that without the agrarian reform, the redistribution of land, the fruit boom of Pinochet never would have happened. Allende and Frey, during the agrarian reform, they massively expand the planting of vineyards and orchards, and they create a national fruit development plan to export even more to the United States. So, socialists want exports, Christian Democrats want exports. It's certainly not just Pinochet, right? Pinochet just takes that in a more vicious direction and, suppresses labor and all political opposition.
It's national histories understood and looked at transnationally. And I think that's really something that clearly has continued to guide the rest of your research. You talk about rebel coolies in the War of the Pacific, so you're looking at Chinese populations in Peru and Chile in the 19th century. And so I was wondering if,
I'm still doing agriculture.
Yeah.
I'm still doing gender. I'm still doing labor. Yeah.
I was wondering, for this kind of most recent project, if you could talk about sort of how you've landed here.
Sure, yeah.
And why it was important to you to talk about Chinese populations and gender
absolutely.
in this context.
Well, as a labor historian of Latin America, I've been seeing Chinese in the footnotes for years, right? We know that Chinese are in Latin America since colonial times, and in the 19th and the 20th century, they're a significant part of Latin American labor forces. It is only recently, in the last decade, that we've started to have really serious histories written about Chinese Latin American populations. And so I really wanted to turn my focus to that because Chinese were very significant as a labor force in Peru and in Chile on sugar plantations and in nitrate mines before the War of the Pacific, which is Chile's invasion of Peru and Bolivia and annexation of what will become the nitrate mines of Chile. I was interested in focusing on the Chinese because it is a way to think about what constitutes Latin America differently. Latin American studies, in a lot of ways, has been thought of as a formation that has very little relationship to Asia until the 21st century. That's historically inaccurate, and yet historians and people in all fields have kind of collaborated or colluded and creating narratives about Latin America and Latin American nation that exclude Asian presence and put them in the footnotes. Oh yeah, we all know about those Chinese railway workers or the Chinese plantation workers or the coolie trade. Yeah, well, we know about that. Put that in the footnote, right? This is a book that centers Chinese labor. Chinese men were the backbone of Peru's sugar export industry in the 19th century, and they become allies of the Chilean military during Chile's invasion of Peru because they rise up on plantations against Peruvian masters and will become incorporated into parts of Chile, which hadn't been Chile before because they had been Peru, and they have been Chinese, Peruvian, and Chinese Chilean populations for well over 150 years now. So I was interested in taking my interest in gendered agrarian labor and looking at the 19th century and thinking about the long connection of China with Latin America.
I think it's really a fascinating project that you've kind of landed on most recently. Super interested as well to kind of see where this keeps going for you, because seeing this sort of trajectory of starting in 1991, in Chile.
With women in one community.
And then kind of being able to see methodologically a little bit how your research has led you to where you are now. And to be able to tell these slightly more unexpected stories that are really impactful to start talking about and change the way that we think about some of these historical moments. So I want to say thank you again.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. It's been great to be here.
It's wonderful to be able to talk with you about your research. I'm sure as well anybody listening is grateful for the experience to hear you talk a little bit more at length about it. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. Nice.
Oh, look how quick it's 1 minute to 4.
I know. I know.
All right.
I took a decision in the moment, and because basically this place is supposedly closing at 4.
This is good. That you have more than enough.
Yeah, I think.
And just grab a couple
wrap
things.